I'm Kurt Wagner.
And I'm Mike Epley.
We're old college debate teammates who disagree about pretty much everything as often as possible.
In each episode, we examine a question inspired by the week's events.
Despite our disagreements, we're friends. We respect each other, we keep each other honest, and we have fun doing it.
And most importantly, we drink.
Offering a fresh, informed snapshot of the debates that dominate contemporary discourse, this is Rightbrain, Leftbrain.
Happy Friday morning, or whatever day, or whatever time it is. Welcome to Rightbrain, Leftbrain, the champagne of podcasts.
This episode of Rightbrain, Leftbrain is brought to you by way of...
Let's see. We got the Kraken. We got Budweiser on my side of the table, the left side.
We have Liney Aquavit,
Yeah,
matured at sea in an oak sherry cask.
Yep, that's an aquavit from Norway.
Twice across the equator.
That's right. I promised I wouldn't talk about Norway anymore, but I'm a lying piece of shit.
Yeah, get used to it. We lie all the time on this podcast.
Yeah. Did I even go to Norway?
Or did he just rob an old Nordic drunk?
And of course, this episode of Right Brain, Left Brain is brought to you by all things lime green, such as Pringles, sour cream and onion, and blah blah IPA, and of course, everyone's favorite, Mountain Dew. Cheers.
Cheers.
All right, to start the show off, we want to say thank you to our loyal listeners. Thank you. Thank you to our Patreon subscribers.
We're always trying to make the show better, so give us feedback, comments, suggestions. You can add us or DM us on Twitter, Rightbrain Kurt. That's my handle on everything. Mike Leftbrain on Twitter, Leftbrain Mike on everything else, or RBLB Pod on everything, Twitter, Facebook, social media. Or just search for Rightbrain Leftbrain. You'll find us.
So what happened this week? Well, let's first talk about the things we're not going to discuss in this episode.
Yes. Like, say, the life and tragic end of Oreo, the real-life model for Rocket Raccoon from the famous Guardians of the Galaxy movies.
Yeah.
Who died at the ripe old age of 10.
Now, I'm not an expert on raccoon years. I'm pretty sure it's about 11 to 1. So that's pretty old. That's like over 100 years, raccoon years old.
He's pretty old. And then to make it even better, like nobody dragged him dead, bleeding from the mouth into a McDonald's like a homeless person did here in San Francisco. So he meant a much more graceful end with a much more, ceremonious burial, I'm sure.
Hey, to be fair, we can't be certain that the man was homeless. He could have just been your average San Francisco resident and just been crazy.
and also been very rich and has a condo.
We're only commemorating the death of a raccoon rather than the death of the human race because CB2, the big fucking asteroid, did a big unannounced flyby of the Earth.
The big tragedy here is that this asteroid did not hit the Earth and did not put us out of the misery and the horrible shit show that is contemporary politics.
Let's see what else happened. The South American country Guyana discovered massive oil deposits offshore. And of course, then the U.S. discovered a new country in need of freedom.
America.
Of course, Republicans, the president, and Democrats continue to bicker about whether or not to have another shutdown over the border wall. And furthermore, Jeff Bezos was sextorted by the National Enquirer, real news source, National Enquirer, who wanted him to stop bad press at the Washington Post, which, of course, Jeff Bezos now owns. And in the ultimate big dick move, Bezos published the blackmail emails on the internet and said, quote, "I won't be intimidated. My cock is glorious. Your move, Enquirer."
In a brilliant entendre, the guy who owns the National Enquirer, his name is Pecker. That's the guy who was trying to blackmail Bezos. And it ended with Bezos just making a bunch of like big statements that involved me like, show you my Pecker. Like, you know what I mean? Just like taunting them, being like, I'm so rich. Just show the world my taint. I don't care. And Ilhan Omar is a huge anti-Semite, which we all knew. So, and the Ilhan Omar's anti-Semite chronicles continue, and the whole world is watching.
And I want to die. But we're not going to debate any of that stuff this week. This week, we are debating
the Green New Deal.
The Green New Deal.
Well, Mike, why don't you tell us about these garbage ideas that your people are proffering.
Okay, so in recent days, Senator Ed Merkley and Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez introduced House Resolution 109, or the Green New Deal. It's a non-binding resolution meant to outline a general plan to massively curtail carbon emissions while undertaking sweeping economic changes, boosting jobs, and bolstering workers' rights. So what's up with it? Well, according to an early draft that's now deleted but then saved, and you can read it, but it's not technically official, the Green New Deal seeks to implement a, quote, World War II scale mobilization that focuses the robust, creative economic engine of the United States on reversing climate change by fully rebuilding our crumbling infrastructure, restoring our natural ecosystems, dramatically expanding renewable power generation, overhauling our entire transportation system, upgrading all our buildings, jumpstarting U.S. clean manufacturing, transforming U.S. agriculture, and putting our nation's people to work doing what they do best, making the impossible possible.
It further continues. A recent IPCC report declared that global temperatures must be kept below 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels to avoid the most severe impacts of changing climate. This calls for global reductions of greenhouse gas emissions by 40 to 60% by 2030. The U.S. contributes 20% of global emissions. To hit these global targets, the U.S. must not only get to a greenhouse gas emissions neutral society by 2030, but it must also lead this change abroad to avert climate catastrophe.
So despite being a non-binding resolution that, even if it were to pass, wouldn't technically do anything, it is quite a large bill, sort of a granola manifesto, an epic poem, an ode to Gaia. And I've read it and it's great, but we're not going to read it here. It would take almost as long for us to read it here as it has taken me to explain why we're not going to read it here.
Mike doesn't want to mention the part where it gives a job to everybody who doesn't want to work.
No, that's in the other version. But if you do want to hear the full text of the bill, scrub ahead to the end of this episode. We will have a full reading that rolls right after the credits.
But suffice to say,
the
Green New Deal says to do no less than...
Wait a minute. Pause. Say that again?
I literally just read what it said.
Suffice
to say, suffice. No, you're right. That's how I said it.
You know what? That reminds me of a Simpsons quote.
Yeah.
Where Lisa says, "Run, Santa's little helper, run like the wind." And she's like, "Oh, I guess I only ever read that word," or something like that. Anyway, yeah, suffice it to say, the Green New Deal seeks to do no less than to, according to the text of the bill, quote, secure for all people of the United States for generations to come clean air and water, climate and community resiliency, healthy food, access to nature, and a sustainable environment. So it sounds great, right?
Yeah. Who doesn't believe that a non-binding resolution will deliver these things?
I don't know, Roosevelt.
So how does it pull? Overall, the public seems to be into the idea of it, depending on who you ask. In a Yale poll from December, 80% of Americans at least somewhat support some form of quote-unquote Green New Deal, including 92% of liberals and 69% of conservative respondents. But to be fair, 82% of them have never heard of the phrase Green New Deal back then. So the question that they were really asked was, some members of Congress are proposing a Green New Deal for the United States. They say that a Green New Deal will produce jobs and strengthen America's economy by accelerating the transition from fossil fuels to clean renewable energy. Woo! The deal would generate 100% of the nation's electricity from clean renewable sources within the next 10 years.
Fuck yeah.
Upgrade the nation's energy grid,
yes,
buildings, and transportation infrastructure.
That's what I'm talking about.
Increase energy efficiency, invest in green technology research and development, and provide training and jobs for the green new economy. How much do you support or oppose the idea?
When it comes to the American population who have never heard of the Green New Deal, they're cool with the idea of it, but how do politicians seem to be reacting? Well, it is gaining steam on the congressional left. 60 House Democrats and 9 Senate Democrats currently support the initiative officially, including every Democratic presidential candidate so far, and Bernie Sanders.
Of course.
But notably, no congressional Republicans support the bill.
Goddamn right.
So it seems pretty clear that the dividing line tends to be at least somewhat partisan on this topic. But when it comes to regular people, generally liberals say, well, we got to save the environment. And apparently that's a partisan issue for some reason, if only in Congress, where conservatives are paid to allow businesses to destroy the planet.
And generally on the right, conservatives say you got to be able to pay for that. And you don't even know what you're paying for. And no.
Well, that brings us to the question for today. Is it time for a Green New Deal?
I say you'll have to wrench this carbon from my cold, dead hands, which are also made of carbon.
And I say guns don't kill people. People kill themselves slowly with industrialization. With that, let's fucking drink.
Let's drink.
To carbon. Carbon giveth and carbon taketh away.
Cheers.
Ooh, that's an aquavit, all right. Kind of tastes like flowers.
It tastes like flowers, but in a Lizzie, look at the flowers kind of way. Just look at the flowers, Lizzie. 7 to 8.
Oh, is that where she shoots the little kid?
Yeah, it's where she shoots the kid to death.
Yeah, shit. Man, that's a deep cut. All right, I guess I'll go first. I'll start with what we in the debate world call the framework. So there's a problem. Obviously, the human race is in really big trouble. And not just the human race, but lots of animal and plant species as well. If we don't slow down our rate of fucking up the fucking planet. I'm not going to go much deeper here on this because, thank God, Kurt is not a climate denier, as so many conservatives still are. Amazingly. People that have spent a lot longer studying this shit than Kurt and I have come to a more or less consensus that we are approaching a tipping point with our climate. If the average global temperature climbs more than 1.5 degrees higher than it was prior to industrialization, by 2030, the global climate will undergo drastic enough changes as to be irreversible. That means that some of the shit that we've been seeing in recent years is going to not just continue forever, but it's also going to continue getting worse forever. That means rising tides. That means bigger and more extreme weather shifts like the kind that we've been seeing. Despite when Donald Trump's like, oh, it's a record low temperature in Minnesota this year. Where's your climate change now? It's like, you dumb son of a bitch. I'm going to kill myself.
You know that he does that just to give liberals a heart attack.
No, he does that because he's an old, crotchety, senile, old conservative man. He believes that shit.
He loves giving liberals an aneurysm.
He does, but he's not doing it. He's not doing it with full knowledge that climate change is real. I mean, it would make me happy if I thought he was, but he's not. Anyway, we're talking about harsher blizzards. We're talking about bigger hurricanes. We're talking about stronger tornadoes, longer droughts that lead to more wildfires, bigger flash floods, and so on. What we're really talking about is hundreds of thousands of people who are going to die due to the increase in natural disasters that are caused by man-made climate change, preventable man-made climate change. We're also talking about the collapses of entire ecosystems, the risk of that also leading to food shortages. So why should we pass a government plan, this big sweeping non-binding resolution and all of the plans that might come underneath it to solve these issues instead of leaving it up to corporations or the private market? Well, according to the draft of the Green New Deal, quote, the level of investment required to make the Green New Deal successful is massive, even if every billionaire and company came together and were willing to pour all their resources into this investment, the aggregate value of investments would not be sufficient. That's even if they gave enough of a fuck to give up all their money to solve this problem.
They don't.
They don't.
You think the fidget spinners buy themselves? I think you're ignoring some things here, Mike. I'm sorry to interrupt your argument, but
we'll get to fidget spinners. Continuing the quote, that's why we must utilize World War II era and New Deal style financing, which commits to long-term benefits instead of short-term quarterly returns. Corporations literally do not give a fuck about the environment. The Exxon CEO is going to be rich whether or not Florida is underwater. And even though it might be better for most of us if Florida goes underwater, that's probably not something we want if we have loved ones living there, as I do.
And not if you have Republicans there who need to deliver you electoral victory like I do.
Like they needed in the year 2000. So like Roosevelt's New Deal, the Green New Deal is not itself a plan. It's more of a program. There will be several different plans underneath this program that are voted on individually by the legislature. Some examples of plans that we can undergo might include laws that incentivize the states to transition to renewable forms of energy like wind, solar, hydroelectric, and so on. Legislation that incentivizes infrastructure upgrades to improve efficiency of buildings, as well as legislation that expands land conservation as has historically been done. Because as we know, when you conserve land, that helps in itself to mitigate carbon-based climate change. According to all of the actual experts who spend their time studying this shit, we do know that only a massive effort at this point that includes actual sacrifices, hits to the economy, things that might hurt a little bit, are going to be enough to solve this problem to save all these lives.
Meatless Mondays and dickless Tuesdays.
There's a sort of like nice ring to it, Meatless Monday. And with that, I rest my case. Now let's drink.
All right.
Me from my goblet, you from yours. Cheers.
Word.
All right, motherfucker. So what do you think? Did I change your mind? Green New Deal. Sound good? Not great, not good. Somewhere in between. Sound good?
Sound good? It sounded bad.
Somewhere between great and bad. Okay.
No, just bad. It sounded bad because I don't really like the Green New Deal. And in fact, there's this way of arguing the proposition in debate that we call a critique, right? The question itself is wrong, and having a debate about the question itself is kind of wrong. The problem is asking for a government solution to a problem that hasn't even been actually fully defined when you examine the details, and that's not really a plan. So it's true that man-made activity can be proven to definitely link to harmful environmental effects, like when a company dumps something in the river that is toxic and then people get cancer linked to that kind of toxin, right? Like, I got to give my friends on the left credit for the fact that we closed the hole in the ozone layer through eliminating CFCs, but references to rising heat levels since the industrial era, and you always see these charts that express what heat levels were, starting in the year 1880 or in the 1800s, right? Ignoring that Earth's long history of rising and falling heat patterns is actually very, very complex, and it's not as simple as our friends on the left like to make it out to be. We've had a much hotter, more rapidly rising temperature time period in human history called the medieval warming period by scientists, right? And my ultimate point is that the biggest harm of warming isn't unique in human history. We've had warming levels at this level or higher before. Like, if we actually tie legislative efforts to things that are proven, we can't say in the status quo right now that there's 100% correlation to, say, each 5-mile drive and each 50-mile plane trip and each cow fart, like how much provable damage that does to the environment and how much it adds to the man-made climate change phenomenon, and how much the man-made climate change phenomenon is necessarily abnormal from how much climate change we might just be experiencing as a normal part of the overall warming and cooling history of the Earth. So these are a lot of leaps that we're taking here. So the idea of regulating that on the macro and micro level to the nth degree using an enormous expansion of government infrastructure, power, and taxation, it's pretty absurd. And as we've seen from the Obama administration's attempts at reshaping the green economy through massive subsidies to Solyndra, to Fisker Automotive, the list goes on and on and on and on about the number of failures that came out of the Obama administration's green initiatives, that we spent billions and billions, way more than enough money to build a wall. Every carbon credit cap trade scheme that's ever been attempted has failed, and California's new governor, Gavin Newsom, is abandoning the high-speed rail program that is supposed to be a prototype of the idea behind the new Green New Deal, right?
Can't win for losing.
That's what I'm saying. The Green New Deal talks all day about how you're going to replace air travel and car travel with rail, and then here we have Democratic shining star Gavin Newsom pulling out of high-speed rail because it's just an expensive boondoggle that's not going to work. All these programs do is waste money, right? Like, when we try things that the Green New Deal is talking about, all they do is waste money, they don't work, and they're themselves a disadvantage to the plan. But they don't solve anything. So let me move on to why your plan doesn't solve for these problems. This program proposes to fix vaguely defined issues without explaining how it's actually going to do it, right? Like, it talks about, it's going to add to this, which we think is good, and this, that, which we think is good, but we don't really know how much that actually impacts climate change. And there's all kinds of cities like Beijing that have high-speed rail all day long, but they don't necessarily get rid of cars, and pollution problems there don't go away. So it seems like a bigger version of previous failures, but at a greater taxpayer expense. Or if it's not a greater taxpayer expense, then it doesn't spend any money and that it doesn't actually do anything. Either way, you're caught in a logic bind where the Green New Deal doesn't solve for anything. When the real driver of renewable technology and things that are good for reducing carbon emissions is the free market. People have not been switching to hybrid cars because of green green energy initiatives. People are switching to hybrids because they get twice, 3 times the gas mileage, dog, at a time when gas is going up. That's what makes people switch over to green energy. They're switching over to green energy because it makes economic sense. There aren't government incentives on used hybrids. They have that same high sale and resale value because they're innovative, money-saving technologies, and it's not because they ever needed the government to help move them in the marketplace. And like the same logic also applies to how solar panels are becoming more and more of a thing. And then let's not even get into the fact that some of these green initiatives have their own polluting after effects, right? Like a lot of these quote-unquote renewable technologies, they create new environmental hazards that we haven't even started to deal with yet because we've only started using them on a certain scale. So either way, you have a solvency problem and then a future problem that we don't even know about if we have made a new one instead. That's the crux of my argument.
All right. Okay. All right. That's right. Cheers.
It's clear and I don't even know what it is.
Let's drink it. Okay, so I got a few things to say about what this piece of shit had to say.
I mean, I am a piece and I am shit, but I'm not a piece of shit, and that's why I draw the objection.
It's in the of. So I have a lot of areas of disagreement, but there's a few key ones that I need to talk about. Number one, Kurt suggests that the country has been shifting toward green energy because of the market and not because of regulation or incentives or subsidies or anything like that. But while I can give you that as green tech gets cheaper and cheaper, of course, and more reliable, it becomes more marketable, that's true. But it's also true that part of the reason that green tech can compete is because of literal government intervention. Look at how, for example, California emissions regulations have shaped the global vehicle marketplace in past decades. Look at things like carbon taxes that have played a huge part in making green energy more affordable to produce. The same is true with like gas taxes, right? And tax rebates for purchasing hybrid cars, etc., right? You talk about hybrids, you say that the reason that people switch to hybrid cars is because they're cheaper by the mile to drive. In the olden days, in like the year 2000, right, when a fucking Prius was like $50,000 off the line for this like little economy car, the reason that people were able to switch is because the government would frequently subsidize the entry cost into that technology, right? So you might be like, well, fuck, you better give me a big ass tax credit if I'm going to buy this energy efficient car. And then not only do I get the better miles per gallon, but also I was able to purchase this car because I got the tax credit or the subsidy.
Well, it's also because celebrities such as Leonardo DiCaprio and Larry David
famously drove Priuses.
Made the technology sexy. Larry David would never make anything sexy.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
I'm at least quoting DiCaprio as one incident where he showed up at like a thing
in a Prius,
and then it's like, oh my God. It's like, yeah, it's so good. Why would you not? Oh my God, you're a piece of shit if you don't drive it like me, Leo. That's capitalism, baby.
Yeah, well, that's true, right? But it's a form of capitalism anyway, right? Government intervention is just another mechanism of capitalism, especially when it comes to market intervention.
No, baby.
Yeah, it's part of it. It's part
baby.
of it. Well, tell that to me driving in the fast lane with one person in the car in my Prius. I can do that.
You
shit.
stole that Prius.
I got it for a steal of a price thanks to government subsidies. The same is true, right, with something like solar energy. You're right that if the mechanism isn't in some way better for the consumer, or at least equal for the consumer, that people aren't going to be more likely to buy in. But when it comes to something like solar energy, right, if you go to a homeowner and say, hey, would you rather pay for electricity to be piped into your house or not pay, and instead have solar panels, and then the grid pays you for the energy that you produce, and by the way, you're not hurting the environment, like, who's not going to take that if the cost is zero, right? Not that that's really a thing, but the government in many states and the federal government has subsidized solar panels in the past. This is just one example of how this kind of works. So while you're right that some markets are not going to work, like a bad business is a bad business. It doesn't matter how much the government subsidizes it. And we've seen this through different failed businesses that have been subsidized, right? Like under Obama.
I don't want to jump ahead, but yeah, you're right. Like a subsidy to a bad business cannot stop it from being a failed. Well, you can subsidize a failed business.
You can keep it going for a minute.
Shout out to Amtrak.
Yeah, right. But government incentives have proven time and again to drive the marketplace. Now, there have been failures, of course, but it's still shown. And this is an important one, too. You talk about how climate change is somewhat man-made, but it's not entirely man-made. And it's really difficult to know what is part of like these 10,000 or more year swings in global temperatures and what is being created by our carbon footprint and all the shit that we burn. And it's hard to know like what the monetary value of one cow fart is or the monetary value of 5 miles driven, right? But what we do know is that a cow fart does have a cost.
And hold up. This is an important tangent.
Yeah.
Are we going to start taxing especially gaseous individuals? Because I think that that's an unfair tax on people who like frozen burritos.
That'd be the quickest way to get my no vote.
And mine.
And so what's important to recognize is that we do know, and we can agree that these cow farts and these drives and these plane trips do have some cost to the environment, right? We don't know necessarily what it is, and you're right about that, but there is a cost. And so if we could, for example, for free, no longer contribute to climate change, would we do that? Of course, you and I would both for free do that, right? So the question is, what's the risk? How much is it worth?
I would help destroy the environment for free as a Republican.
As long as you get to wear a red hat. The question is...
Make the environment great again.
Oh, my God. My mind's exploding at the slogan, Make the environment great again. Anyway, you piece of shit. You get what I'm saying. And so do our listeners.
Sorry.
So you talk about you're like being upset by the uncertainty, right? But you can buy into at least the concept and then evaluate each new law, right? You're like, the Green New Deal, we don't know what it is. A, it doesn't do anything. And B, even if it did, we wouldn't know that would be effective or solvent, but at least in terms of the concept, you could agree, right? In theory, it would be good for us to mitigate man-made climate change, and that maybe we should be evaluating new laws on their own merits that might contribute to that in some positive way for most people. Yeah? I know you're generally against regulation, but you've admitted that some regulations have been good. Like
I don't want to jump too far ahead to the common ground section, but I will say that if we can come up with areas of agreement about action that can be taken, I'm with it.
Cool. All right, so what do you have to say about my shit?
Well, it's not the Green New Deal. That's what I got to say. So look, all technology becomes cheaper as it can be produced at scale. And the government has never been good at picking those technologies in the incubator stage and launching them.
Sometimes true.
And we spend a lot of money on that incubator stage stuff for stuff that, like, if it really can make it, it will on its own. And I mentioned the failures from earlier, like Solyndra and the others, but only the market offering these can produce the success of mass scale technology. And it's not going to be subsidies for products that people don't want to buy. I would be willing to admit that it's humanly conceptually possible that, if not likely, I can even grant that subsidies helped advance hybrids and solar technology, but those are good technologies that would have taken off on their own, and then they wouldn't have taken off quite as quickly. But when you think about the overall impacts of like how unclear climate change is as far as man-made contributions, I think it's negligible when you factor in the billions of dollars that we spend on losers along the way. You know, the market's not always as fast as we want it to be, but subsidies for products that people don't want to buy are not going to get us there. You would have had as much success with hybrids, solar panels, and things like these right now without the subsidies, without as much billions of dollars lost, if we hadn't spent as much federal money throwing billions and billions at everything renewable that you could fucking shake a stick at and put your ass up to the federal government for a poking.
That's totally not true. That's totally not true. These markets wouldn't even be able to exist without some help to get into the game when it comes to like energy. You got to have some help. Like how is some little rinky-dink solar company going to compete with PG&E if the government's not like intervening, being like
the market's not create space. The market's not that simple. The market has all kinds of openings for innovators at the smaller level. Like, it's not a government subsidy that made the hybrid automobile. It's not the government subsidy that made it introduced to the market in the first place. The best thing that you're arguing for the solvency of green initiatives in terms of introducing hybrids is that they help them get there faster after other people already spent billions of dollars in the private sector developing and marketing them, and then getting a prostitute to suck Leo DiCaprio's dick and then have him go out and talk about how great hybrids are.
Well, that's all good too.
Right. That's all capitalism.
But the subsidies are part of the capitalism.
They're not. They're anti-capitalist and they're anti-free
market.
They're anti-free market, and they're anti-capitalist. But that's a really niggling debate that we don't have to have.
Right.
Look, when we see like things that actually help environmental impacts of technology is not going away. The problem is that technology generates all these harms in the first place, and technology itself is the measure of progress. Right.
Fucking humans.
It's true. We can't go back to an agrarian society and horse-drawn carriages and like things like that, which had their own harms of like diseases and stuff. We're not going back. You think that having horse shit in the streets everywhere was good for the environment?
Depends where they paved.
It's more sustainable to have environmentally friendly developments like hybrid cars, solar panels come from the free market because it's held together by voluntary associations based on their suitability for the parties involved, rather than forced or encouraged by government activity because it's politically pleasing to voters and or politicians. And then that, as soon as that thing stops being politically pleasing, it gets removed from the economy, and then it causes a shockwave through the economy when, like, hey, all of a sudden we're not subsidizing something that doesn't work anymore. As science does more hard discovery on specific harms that to the environment in terms of global warming and everything else, technology can be developed and sold that specifically addresses it. And the places where that have specific harms as a result of environmentalism, you can develop technologies that help from there.
Yeah, that's where the grant money comes in. Go ahead.
So what is your example of subsidies enhancing green energy that was otherwise like permanently unviable? And like, when did that difference in turning them suddenly become viable?
Well, I think that question is like needlessly loaded, right? You're asking me a question that's about something that's already designed to fail. When you throw in there, like, what's my example of subsidies that are otherwise permanently unviable? Like, never, right? A permanently unviable marketplace is permanently unviable whether it's subsidized or not. But my argument really is that if I invest in 3 technologies, one of them is wind and one of them is solar and one of them is like harnessing the laughter from capybara in South America, and wind and solar work and capybara laughter goes under, and I wasted $1 billion on capybara laughter, I'm still going to make those investments, right? So when it comes to ideas that are permanently unviable, like, yeah, I know they're going to go under.
Right.
That's
The
okay. I don't mind.
The things that already work would be invested in anyway.
I don't mind
whether or not the government wastes the money.
I don't mind Solar City going under. I don't mind these different poorly run companies going under. I don't mind whole industries. I don't mind the whole concept of clean coal going under, right? I don't mind ugly nuclear energy and these poorly run power plants that have meltdowns and also destroy the environment going under. It sucks that we subsidize things that don't work, but what's more important is that we're subsidizing things that do work. I would trade subsidizing something that works for having subsidized 2 things and one of them doesn't work. Now, furthermore, solar power is subsidized by the federal government with this 30% investment tax in the status quo. I won't go into the details, but we subsidize solar. And data from the Federal Energy Regulation Commission shows that since 2009, solar power capacity has multiplied by more than 89 times. And wind power capacity, which we also subsidize, has increased 6-fold. So instead of asking me about the things that are unviable that we've invested in, let's compare those things to the things that are viable that we've invested in and see if the overall investment pays off, right? When I buy a stock portfolio, right, like I invest in social media, I buy that folder filled with stocks, and it includes Facebook and Twitter and Tumblr and MySpace and fucking whatever, right? And 5 or 6 of those go under, but a handful of them do well and 1 or 2 of them explodes. My overall investment is paid off. It doesn't matter that some of that portfolio has gone under. That's the argument that I make.
Yeah, but this is not a stock portfolio based on, because see, even in that stock portfolio situation, everybody involved in assembling that portfolio has said, okay, none of these are hopeful. We're sure that all of these are going to succeed. Nobody throws something into a stock portfolio because it would be nice to see if it works. And that's the difference between your proposal and the idea of a stock portfolio.
On the contrary, people invest in new technologies and new market trends all the time.
The things that you're talking about putting government money into are things where the private sector has already said, we're not going to fund this. Everything that we're talking about putting government money into is capital that the private market has not spent because the private market has said, this is not a risk that we think is likely to return investment. Yeah, sometimes things are quirky, right, in a stock portfolio, but they're quirky in a way where, like, this is quirky, but we really believe and we're willing to put risk our jobs on it, that this stock is going to perform. You don't take a risk on it the way that you do in government. Because if you could get all that funded in the private marketplace, you wouldn't turn to government funding at all.
Right. Well, getting rid of hypotheticals, we can at least talk about the principle. It's worth taking a risk to invest in something that might pay off. When we look at the investments that the government has made in subsidizing renewable energy and renewable technology, overall, those investments have paid off.
Well, I mean,
and it's paid off to the point. It's clearly, the proof is in the pudding, in that the renewable energy segment is the fastest growing sector of the energy economy, which means that the government, when it made the decision, like, it's probably a good idea to invest in renewable energy, either that contributed to the sea change where people are shifting to renewables, or it pushed the sea change. Either way, it was a smart investment overall.
Right. But what you're saying in this debate is that your only defense of this is the successes, not that you can really pull a lot of examples of something where government spending pulled something that would have never succeeded in the private market.
No, because like I said, you're asking me to show you an instance where something that failed succeeded.
My argument is that there's nothing from green investment, government investment in green technology that hasn't been successful, that wouldn't have been successful on its own without the government investing, and that everything else is just a loss based off of people who can politically jockey themselves for billions in government cash.
I think you're doing a weird logical workaround where what you mean to say is that some things work and some things don't, and the government shouldn't invest in things that don't work, and you're not really weighing in on the government investing in things that do work and have proven to work, except like a brief mention here or there of like the ozone layer or hybrids or electricity or solar electricity.
If Enron had been on the public dollar, it would have hurt way more people and it would have gone on for way longer. And in the private sector,
it's a good thing that we didn't invest in that.
Right. But that's my point is that the private sector, you limit the exposure to people who've made their own choices and invested their own money knowing what they were investing in. And then people who were defrauded along the way that can literally file lawsuits and get their money back. Whereas when you spend the public's money on Enron, the fraud goes on for twice as long and based on even less ability to return profit, whether or not.
We might disagree on a case-by-case basis of what deserves investment and what doesn't. I would be a little bit less risk-averse than you would, it sounds like. And you might have a hard time deciding to pull the trigger to invest on anything if you were the guy. But at the same time, we can both see that the U.S. has invested in some things that have failed and some things that have not failed. And that might be a good way to segue into common ground. What do you think?
I think that's objectively true. And
it's definitely a good reason to segue into drinking.
Yes, I agree. Let's go back to the Kraken.
Barely even fucked with my Budweiser.
It's not a race, it's a podcast.
Why is it always got to be about race? All right, so what do you think? A little bit of common ground, maybe?
So, as a bit of common ground on this, not every government effort to promote things is always bad. And part of my conservative soul just had a spasm. But there are some things that I thought that would never work out that seem to be doing some good. I'm not always right. And as much as I rag on the Obama-era green jobs initiatives now, like at least some of that green job waste comes from the stimulus. Republicans like to sort of play armchair quarterback and say that the stimulus would have been way better and less wasteful from a Republican.
Yeah, it seems fine to me. Let's have a Republican green jobs initiative. What would that be called? Red, green. What do you get when you mix red and green? Some kind of weird, ugly brown.
As much as I argue that voters in 2016 gave Trump a voter mandate to do certain things like the tariffs that I mentioned before, if I say that voters have given Trump that mandate in 2016, then Obama won the election in 2008 during an economic hemorrhage when the electorate asked the president of the United States at that time period to take decisive action to stop economic freefall. He did, and the free fall and economic hemorrhaging fucking stopped, right?
Yeah, remember the American auto industry that still exists today.
Yeah. And I would also say that I really applaud everything that is done in the free market to combat things that have carbon emissions and polluting effects. And that also I really, really, as a firm believer in 10th Amendment federalism, think that if states and municipalities want to offer up their own money for programs, I really, really think that that's something that they have the full blessing of constitutional theory to do, even if I don't think that it's a good deal. And honestly, I don't really object to California giving, like, say, hybrid owners the HOV lane, right? Things that we do just to encourage hybrids. I don't think that that's all a bad idea.
Okay, well, that's a big step.
I'm just willing to go back and forth about incentives versus spending versus...
Right.
I don't think the Green New Deal as a whole is a thing, but I'm not saying that every government effort to fight climate change is necessarily bad.
Right.
I just don't like massive perversions of the free market where I think that real environmental breakthroughs actually come from.
All right. Well, fair enough. I got something there. So I actually have a couple of olive branches to extend as well. As Kurt has mentioned, and as we've talked about, it is true that the Green New Deal is not actually any kind of binding law that's going to do anything on its own. And so we don't know what actual policies might come under a Green New Deal. All of those policies could suck, and they could be a massive waste of money for all we know. I can grant that to Kurt. I think we should be evaluating these policies on a case-by-case basis, whether or not we do it under the banner of, quote, Green New Deal. Obviously, there's going to be tons of environment-based legislation coming into the forefront because, of course, as I believe, we're reaching the point of like the emergency that we need to be in for Americans to start giving a fuck about the planet. I'm also sensitive to arguments that states might do it better. United States has a unique problem in the urban sprawl of our country. Our country is a continent, and transporting people and goods across hundreds and sometimes thousands of miles every single day, that creates unique challenges. It's not a coincidence that the United States, just as one country out of hundreds, contributes 20% of the ecological harm of the entire planet. And
USA, USA.
Go big or go home. But to me, that calls for a more massive effort to undergo changes to mitigate the climate disaster that humans are creating, but also the fact that we are so big and we are 50 unique states with their own laws and regulations. It could be good for the states on their own to undergo climate policy. And also, of course, I'm down with the federal government working with states individually to develop their own kind of renewable programs and have that work as well as possible. I understand that sometimes smaller is more efficient, and I think that's kind of a conservative principle, and I agree with it, and I'm cool with it. I like that we both believe that humans create and contribute to negative environmental impacts, and that humans should be trying to slow that down and stop it because it's getting serious.
And I like that we agree that we don't conclusively know that 100% of climate change is man-made and how much of it is.
And I like that we agree that the best way to find out how much humans are contributing to climate change is for us to stop and then measure the difference.
I don't know about that, though. I think maybe we ought to wrap this up in some point instead.
Before it breaks into another debate. Thank you so much for listening. I'm Leftbrain Mike.
And I'm Rightbrain Kurt.
As always, please share our podcast wherever you have the opportunity to do so. Please comment on our shit whenever you feel so compelled to do so. And please like everything we post, whether you like it or not.
Yes, you can find us on social media. The show's accounts, RBLB Pod on Twitter, Pornhub, Instagram, the Rightbrain Leftbrain community on Facebook.
Yeah, and the Rightbrain Leftbrain group on Facebook. Two different places where you can enjoy Rightbrain Leftbrain.
Until next week, I'm Rightbrain Mike.
Wow.
Just give you an idea of how much we drink.
Wow. I'm Leftbrain Mike.
And I'm Rightbrain Kurt.
Until next week, eat less fucking meat, you goddamn animals.
And next time you're getting gas, check the oil. It only takes a few seconds and it's the easiest way to keep your car running.
If you're making a strawberry milkshake or smoothie, don't just cut the top off of the strawberries. You want to actually properly core the strawberry and take all of that starchy part out. That will make your shake more flavorful and less starchy. And now, we will read you the entirety of House Resolution 109, the Green New Deal. Recognizing the duty of the federal government to create a Green New Deal, whereas the October 2008 report entitled Special Report on Global Warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the November 2008 Fourth National Climate Assessment Report found that 1. Human activity is the dominant cause of observed climate change over the past century. 2. A changing climate is causing sea levels to rise and an increase in wildfires, severe storms, droughts, and other extreme weather events that threaten human life, healthy communities, and critical infrastructure. 3. Global warming at or above 2 degrees Celsius beyond pre-industrialized levels will cause A. A mass migration from the regions most affected by climate change. B. More than $500 trillion in lost annual economic output in the United States by the year 2100. C. Wildfires that by 2050 will annually burn at least twice as much forest area in the United States than was typically burned by wildfires in the year preceding 2019. D. A loss of more than 99% of all coral reefs on Earth. E. More than 350 million more people to be exposed globally to deadly heat stress by 2050. And F. A risk of financial damage to I don't even know how much money of public infrastructure and coastal real estate in the United States. I think it's a bajillion. And 4, global temperatures must be kept below 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrialized levels to avoid the most severe impacts of changing climate, which will require A, a global reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from human sources of 40 to 60% from 2010 levels by 2030, and B, net zero global emissions by 2050. Whereas, because the United States has historically been responsible for a disproportionate amount of greenhouse gas emissions, having emitted 20% of global greenhouse gas emissions through 2014 and has high technological capacity, the United States must take a leading role in reducing emissions through economic transformation. Whereas the United States is currently experiencing several related crises with 1. Life expectancy declining while basic needs such as clean air, clean water, healthy food, and adequate health care, housing, transportation, and education are inaccessible to a significant portion of the United States population. 2. A 4-decade trend of wage stagnation, deindustrialization, and anti-labor policies has led to A. Hourly wages overall stagnating since the 1970s despite increasing worker productivity. B. The third worst level of socioeconomic mobility in the developed world before the Great Recession. C. The erosion of the earning and bargaining power of workers in the United States. And D. Inadequate resources for public sector workers to confront the challenges of climate change at local, state, and federal levels. And 3. The greatest income inequality since the 1920s, with A. The top 1% of earners accruing 91% of gains in the first few years of economic recovery after the Great Recession. B. A large racial wealth divide amounting to a difference of 20 times more wealth between the average white family and the average black family. And throwback to a previous episode of Rightbrain, Leftbrain. And C. A gender earning gap that results in women earning approximately 80% as much as men at the median. Whereas climate change, pollution, and environmental destruction have exacerbated systemic racial, regional, social, environmental, and economic injustices, referring to this preamble as, quote, systemic injustices by disproportionately affecting indigenous peoples, communities of color, migrant communities, deindustrialized communities, depopulated rural communities, the poor, low-income workers, women, the elderly, the unhoused, people with disabilities, and youth, referred to in this preamble as, quote, frontline and vulnerable communities, end quote. Whereas climate change constitutes a direct threat to national security of the United States. 1. By impacting the economic, environmental, and social stability of countries and communities around the world. And 2. By acting as a threat multiplier, whereas the federal government led mobilizations during World War II and the New Deal created the greatest middle class in the United States has ever seen. But many members of the frontline and vulnerable communities are excluded from many of the economic and social benefits of those mobilizations. And whereas the House of Representatives reorganizes that a new national, social, industrial, and economic mobilization on a scale not seen since World War II and the New Deal era as historic opportunity. 1, to create millions of good, high-wage jobs in the United States. 2, to provide unprecedented levels of prosperity and economic security for all people of the United States. And 3, to counteract systemic injustice. Now, therefore, be it. That was the preamble, baby.
Take a breath. Take a bow.
Resolved. That it is the sense of the House of Representatives that that's interesting. That it is the sense of the House of Representatives that 1, it is the duty of the federal government to create a Green New Deal, A, to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions through a fair and just transition for all communities and workers. B, to create millions of good, high-wage jobs and ensure prosperity and economic security for all peoples of the United States. C, to invest in the infrastructure and industry of the United States to sustainably meet the challenges of the 21st century. D, to secure for all people of the United States for generations to come. 1, clean air and water. 2, climate and community resiliency. 3, healthy food. 4, access to nature. And 5, a sustainable environment. And E, to promote justice and equity by stopping current, preventing future, and repairing historic oppression of indigenous peoples, communities of color, migrant communities, deindustrialized communities, depopulated rural communities, the poor, low-income workers, women, the elderly, the unhoused, people with disabilities, and youth, referred to in this resolution as, quote, frontline and vulnerable communities. 2, the goals described in subparagraphs A through E of paragraph 1, referred to in this resolution as the Green New Deal goals, should be accomplished through a 10-year national mobilization, referred to in this resolution as the, quote, Green New Deal mobilization, that will require the following goals and projects. A, building resiliency against climate change-related disasters such as extreme weather, including by leveraging funding and providing investments for community-defined programs and strategies. B, repairing and upgrading the infrastructure of the United States, including Little One, by eliminating pollution and greenhouse gas emissions as much as technologically feasible. 2, by guaranteeing universal access to healthy water. 3, by reducing the risk posed by climate impacts. And 4, by ensuring that any infrastructure bill considered by Congress addresses climate change. C, meeting 100% of the power demand in the United States through clean, renewable, and zero emissions energy sources, including 1, by dramatically expanding and upgrading renewable power sources, and 2, by deploying new capacity. D, building or upgrading to energy efficient, distributed, and, quote, smart power grids and ensuring affordable access to electricity. E, upgrading all existing buildings in the United States and buildings new materials to achieve maximum energy efficiency, water efficiency, safety, affordability, comfort, and durability, including through electrification. F, spurring massive growth in clean manufacturing in the United States and removing pollution and greenhouse gas emissions from manufacturing and industry as much as technologically feasible, including by expanding renewable energy manufacturing and investing in existing manufacturing and industry. G, working collaboratively with farmers and ranchers in the United States to remove pollution and greenhouse gas emissions from the agricultural sector as much as technologically feasible, including 1, by supporting family farming. 2, by investing in sustainable farming and land use practices that increase soil health. And 3, by building a more sustainable food system that ensures universal access to healthy food. H, overhauling transportation systems in the United States to remove pollution and greenhouse gas emissions from transportation sector as much as it is technologically feasible, including through investment in 1, zero-emission vehicle infrastructure and manufacturing, 2, clean, affordable, and accessible public transit, and 3, high-speed rail. Little 1, mitigating and managing the long-term adverse health, economic, and other effects of pollution and climate change, including by providing funding for community-defined projects and strategies. J, removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere and reducing pollution by restoring natural ecosystems through proven low-tech solutions that increase soil carbon storage, such as land preservation and afforestation. Afforestation, that's a fun one. K, restoring and protecting threatened, endangered, and fragile ecosystems through locally appropriate and science-based projects that enhance biodiversity and support climate resiliency. L, cleaning up existing hazardous waste and abandoned sites, ensuring economic development and sustainability on those sites. M, identifying other emissions and pollution sources and creating solutions to remedy them. And N, promoting the international exchange of technology, expertise, products, funding, and services with the aim of making the United States the international leader on climate action and to help other countries achieve a Green New Deal. 3, a Green New Deal must be developed through transparent and inclusive consultation, collaboration, and partnership with frontline and vulnerable communities, labor unions, worker cooperatives, civil society groups, academia, and businesses. And 4, to achieve the Green New Deal goals and mobilization, a Green New Deal will require the following goals and projects. A, wait, how much fucking more? No, not that much more. A, providing and leveraging in a way that ensures the public receives appropriate ownership and stake in return on investments, adequate capital, including through community grants, public banks, and other public financing, technical expertise supporting policies and other forms of assistance to communities, organizations, federal, state, and local government agencies, and businesses working on the Green New Deal mobilization, ensuring that the federal government takes into account the complete environmental and social costs and impacts of emissions through 1, existing laws, 2, new policies and programs, and 3, ensuring that frontline and vulnerable communities shall not be adversely affected. C, providing resources, training, and high-quality education, including higher education, to all people of the United States with a focus on frontline and vulnerable communities so that all people of the United States may be full and equal participants in the Green New Deal mobilization. Making public investments in the research and development of new clean and renewable energy technologies and industries. E, directing investments to spur economic development, deepen and diversify industry and business in local and regional economies, and build wealth and community ownership while prioritizing high-quality job creation and economic, social, and environmental benefits in frontline and vulnerable communities and deindustrialized communities that may otherwise struggle with the transition away from greenhouse gas-intensive industries. F, ensuring that the use of democratic and participatory progress that are inclusive of and led by frontline and vulnerable communities and workers to plan, implement, and administer the Green New Deal mobilization at the local level. G, ensuring that the Green New Deal mobilization creates high-quality union jobs that pay prevailing wages, hires local workers, offers training and advancement opportunities, and guarantees wage and benefit parity for workers affected by the transition. H, guaranteeing a job with a family-sustainable wage, adequate family and medical leave, paid vacations, and retirement security to all people of the United States. I, strengthening and protecting the rights of all workers to organize, unionize, and collectively bargain free of coercion, intimidation, and harassment. J, strengthening and enforcing labor, workplace health and safety, anti-discrimination, and wage and hour standards across all employers, industries, and sectors. K, enabling and enforcing trade rules, procurement standards, and border adjustments with strong labor and environmental protections. I, to stop the transfer of jobs and pollution overseas. And 2, to grow domestic manufacturing in the United States. L, ensuring that public lands, waters, and oceans are protected and that eminent domain is not abused. M, obtaining the free, prior, and informed consent of indigenous peoples for all decisions that affect indigenous peoples and their traditional territories, honoring all treaties and agreements with indigenous peoples, and protecting and enforcing the sovereignty and land rights of indigenous peoples. N, ensuring a commercial environment where every business person is free from unfair competition and domination by domestic or international monopolies. And O, providing all people of the United States with 1, high-quality health care, 2, affordable, safe, and adequate housing, 3, economic security, and 4, clean water, clean air, healthy and affordable food, and access to nature.
That's a long-ass thing.
See you next week.
Cheers.